Hello, my name's Dr. John McClain, and in this my YouTube video, I'd like to talk about the importance of rest, reflection, relaxation, and the basic creation concept of the Sabbath, which God instituted in the Old Testament and which Jesus modified but affirmed in the New Testament. The seventh day of rest goes back to creation order. In 6 days, God created the world, and the seventh day he rested. Both accounts of the law, the Decalogue in Exodus and Deuteronomy, affirm that the world was created in 6 literal days, and that on the seventh day they were to rest. In other ancient cultures, like where they came out of Egypt, they had a 10-day week. You didn't get a day off until the 10th day. I know of places in Israel that were kind of mining camps where the Egyptians would bring in slaves and everything, mining camps. Timna comes to mind, copper mining and other things. And they would work the laborers with minimal food, minimal water. They had so many of them. They were just down in small holes, and they hardly lasted a month at a time. And they were required to work each and every day. But some ancient Near Eastern cultures, they did not have a break in the work calendar except every 20 days or every 24 days. And I have read of some that just based the day off on the lunar calendar, which would have been 30 days. And can you imagine how difficult that is? I mean, today we whine and cry at times because we only get Saturday off and Sunday. We should be fortunate to know that we're getting more than people in the rest of history. And having a day off is wonderful. And having a Shabbat, a seventh day off, is wonderful. But it's not wonderful if you use it to continue to work or activity yourself into poor health. And I'm not going to talk about all the medical facts. Those are all there. We know that from our doctors. We know that from all of the research. And we know all of that because we experience it. We exhaust ourselves and we hurt our health. And so I'm not appealing on the basis of that, because that alone isn't the core motivation of life that will help you to fulfill the Sabbath. And I don't mean that in the Old Testament way. I'll explain it as modified by Jesus in the New Testament. But we do need the Sabbath. It is a spiritual discipline. It is a spiritual exercise. We need to learn that there are timeouts. There are opportunities to rest. I'm reminded of the young mother who had a friend over, and her rambunctious little preschooler was running around, and he was playing cowboys. And he came in the room and he put up his little hand like it was a gun, and he shot his mother, and bang, 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 and you're dead. And she fell off the couch and laid down on the floor. And the little guy left. And the friend said to the mother, "What are you doing? Why don't you get up?" And she said, "This is my only opportunity to rest during the day." And so we know we all need rest and a balanced life. So let's look at some of the scriptures that will help us to spiritually appreciate that it is God's command that we have a Sabbath within our lifestyle. Now, beginning with the foundation, Genesis 2:3, then God blessed the seventh day. He sanctified it. He set it apart because in it he rested from all his work which he had created and made. And the word rested has both the idea of to cease activity as well as the idea to be pleased with or to enjoy the outcome of your activities. And that's what God did. God didn't need to rest in the sense of physically, but he took pleasure in his creation. And so this is a foundational principle for all of humanity. Exodus 20, verses 8 through 10, part of the Decalogue, the 10 words. He says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, to keep it separate. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you will not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. Everybody needs a break, deserves a break. God commands the break. And that doesn't mean that you can't do anything. There are groups that, believe that on whatever day they pick as the Sabbath, we have the Seventh-day Adventists, and I don't agree with them demanding that it's Saturday. They're dependent on the Old Testament for that. In Christianity, they began to celebrate the first day of the week, which then became Sunday, as the celebration of the resurrection and the meeting together. There are reform groups that, you can't go fishing, you can't do this, you can't do that, can't go shopping, on and on and on, because it is the Sabbath, and they mix up the Sabbath with the Sunday, not Shabbat, the seventh, which is Saturday. But the truth be known, we don't know the exact day of the week. It is from the beginning of creation. Israel was to keep track of it, and they did, but they turned it into a big legalistic way of salvation and how you earned your salvation and demonstrated your righteousness by keeping the Sabbath. And you remember that Jesus had many Sabbath controversies and debates with the various Jewish groups in his day. But the Exodus says that everyone needs a break and everyone gets a break, and there's a reason for it. Now, even beyond the 1 day a week, Exodus 23:10 through 12 says, you shall sow your land for 6 years and gather in its yield. But on the seventh year, you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat, and whatever they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. Let me bring this down. 6 days you are to do your work, but on the seventh day you shall cease from your labor, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female slave, as well as the stranger, may refresh themselves. So there was the 7-day week Sabbath, and then there was also a 7th year Sabbath, where you let the entire land rest and recover and rejuvenate. and other people to be able to benefit from it. And so this teaches us that we are also allowed, should, and even commanded to take extended periods of time when we can. And I would call those vacations today. Unfortunately, we find in this generation Y and whatever they end up, or I'm sorry, Z, and whatever they call the next one, I think they're calling them the alphas, that the Z parents, the X and the Z parents, are keeping the alpha or our children, grandchildren, so busy with so many activities and primarily sports that these children are not getting the rest that they need, nor the education, nor the reflection that they need to have about God and spirituality. And I will talk about that more as we get into the New Testament. Now, here, the book of Nehemiah, this is after the Assyrian captivity of the 10 northern tribes, the Babylonian captivity of the 2 southern tribes, and those captivities were put in judgment upon the nation because they violated the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, there was 2 years of rest. And if you read Jeremiah, God says through Jeremiah, I have sent you into captivity for 70 years total, 69 and 1 yet to come, because you continually violated the sabbatical year. Instead of letting yourself rest, your family rest, your servants rest, your employees rest, and the nation rest and the land rest, you kept working it because you were greedy, because you didn't trust me, because you were workaholics, because you were following other gods. And they went into captivity. Now, this is Nehemiah, who is leading the generation of the post-generation, the generations after the captive generations, back into the land. And this is what Nehemiah says in Nehemiah 13. In those days, I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine and grapes and figs and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also, men of Tyre were living there who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem, like even in the central place of God's worship. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day, treating the Sabbath day like it was any other day, not a holy day, not a day set apart and sanctified? Did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you are adding to the wrath of Israel by profaning the Sabbath. It came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors be shut and that they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Then I stationed some of my servants at the gates so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Nehemiah realized that they were repeating the sins of the past, and they weren't trusting God, and they weren't resting in the Sabbath of a worship of God. Work, yes, we're created to work. Those who don't work are missing out on a creative pillar, a creative foundation, a creative principle that we are to work and to enjoy our work and to benefit from our work. But when we become workaholics, when we let work become our God, then we will pay the penalty. Now, Ecclesiastes 2:18 through 26. The whole book of Ecclesiastes, if you're a workaholic, you need to read the whole thing. If you are working and you're finding no satisfaction in life or in work, you need to read the whole thing. In the famous theologian, slow down. You're moving too fast. You've got to make things last. Ecclesiastes 2:18 through 26. Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor, for which I had labored under the sun. For I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Is he going to use it wisely, or is he going to waste it? All this work I've done to accumulate this pile of wealth. Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor. That word can also be translated as toilsome labor, for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity or emptiness or futility. Therefore, I completely despaired of all of the fruit of my labor, for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he gives his legacy, his inheritance, to one who has not labored with them, this too is vanity and a great evil. Well, guess what? You're to blame, Solomon. You're to blame, Kohelet, the writer. For what does a man get in all his labor and in all his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is futility. If you're staying up worrying, anxious, and troubled, it's because you're not trusting the Lord, and you're probably doing too much. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and to drink and to tell himself that his labor is good. This is something that we have to tell ourselves. We have to remind ourselves. This also I have seen that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? The answer is no one. It is God who gives us that enjoyment, who gives us that satisfaction. For to a person who is good in his sight, he is given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner, he is given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to the one who is good in God's sight. When he looks at all of it, he says, you know what? This is vanity, emptiness, and striving after the wind. The psalmist said in Psalm 46:10, cease striving. Now, this can literally or truly be translated also, sit back and relax. Find an easy chair. Find a lounger. Find a lazy boy recliner. Sit back and relax and know that I'm God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. We are to cease our anxiety at times, cease our striving. Sit back and relax. God wants you to. Now, when we come to the New Testament, we see these Sabbath controversies between Jesus and the others. And it happened that Jesus was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. What they would do is they would just put their hand out. There we go, there's my hand. Put their hand out at the bottom, and they would roll it up the stalk. they would rub it in their hands and they would have the little grains of nuts, like a trail mix. The Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, the Pharisees decided that. And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and he ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him. Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So Pharisees, they're not violating the Sabbath. They're not reaping. They're not working. They are doing what is good for their own rest, their own Sabbath, their own restoration, renewal, their own nutrition. And then he makes the conclusion to them. You need to understand this. The Son of Man, whom I am, is Lord even of the Sabbath. God makes the rules for the Sabbath, and he clearly laid them down, and the Pharisees turned it into a works system of salvation. Now, in this next passage, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 34, he says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear or pure, your body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters. You can't serve God and wealth. You can't serve God and be a workaholic on 7 days a week. You can't serve God, worship God, gather for worship if you've been out all night exhausting yourself. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. For this reason, I say to you, do not be worried or anxious about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? And who of you, by being worried or anxious, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all of his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grasses of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you? Oh, you of little faith, do not worry. Don't be anxious then, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles, and the Gentiles here in the Gospels is primarily a reference to non-believers, those who don't know God, those who don't follow God, those outside of Israel. For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. So what are we to do? But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So the conclusion, do not worry about tomorrow. What does that mean? You don't have to overwork. You don't have to work 7 days a week. You don't have to work excessively long hours. Why? Because tomorrow will take care of itself. Why? Because God's in charge of tomorrow. Each day, understatement, each day has enough trouble, enough labor, enough work of its own. We need to learn to trust God and to enjoy the Sabbath principle. Now, here again, we don't obey the 10 commandments from the Old Testament. And I've got a post on my website about we are New Covenant Christians, not Old Covenant Christians. We are New Testament Christians. We are not Old Testament Christians. We are not under the law. We're under the teachings of Jesus and the apostles, the disciples, and that we don't have to keep the seventh day. But Jesus, and we will see, the New Testament emphasizes that there is a need for the principle of rest and a day of rest set aside to the Lord. Here we see in Colossians 2:16, Paul says to them, therefore, no one is to act as your judge regarding foods, which was certainly a Jewish dietary issue, or drink, or in respect to a festival. Don't have to keep the Old Testament festivals, but it's a great reminder, and it could be a good spiritual discipline, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. Nobody can tell us what day to rest, to fulfill the creation day of Sabbath now. Things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. No one can tell us what day, but the principle is there from creative order that we as human beings, we need to rest. And I will summarize that at the end. Hebrews chapter 4, 9 through 10, just so that we cover this. It says, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. After the writer of Hebrews talks about the great failure of the Exodus generation, and even of the entrance generation, and the failure of Joshua to bring the people into rest, physical and spiritual rest. He says, for the one who has entered into God's rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. And the works that are talked about in Hebrews 4 are one working for salvation, one trying to be good enough for God. For by grace we are saved through faith, Paul says. This is not of ourselves, salvation, not the faith. The grace and the salvation are not of yourself. Salvation, grace, is a gift from God, not a result of our works, lest anyone, and they would boast, as the Pharisees and all of the Sanhedrin and other groups did of the day and even today. We come into a rest when we understand, as 1 Corinthians 15 says, that we are sinners and that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the basis for our forgiveness. And by accepting him as God's sent Messiah, a Son of God, by believing in him and acknowledging our sin, we are born again and we enter into the final Sabbath rest of God. Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:8, get back up there, but if anyone does not provide for his own, we are to work. In Thessalonians, people are rebuked for not working. The welfare system back then was, if you're able to work and you choose not to work, then you don't eat. You don't eat if you don't work. But if anyone does not provide for his own family, and especially for those of his own personal household, he has denied the faith and he is worse than an infidel or unbeliever. We are to work, but we're to have measured work, not greedy work, not accumulation of wealth for myself work, but work in order to help take care of family and community. As Colossians 3 23 says, whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. So there is a Sabbath principle in the New Testament, and I'd like to summarize it this way. The principle of the Sabbath is that we take some time to rest. We take some time for reflection upon our own lives and activities so that we can have satisfaction in the past and present and moving forward. The Sabbath is to be a time of reverence, of worshiping the Lord, of praising and thanking the Lord, of gathering together as the family of God, of reflecting on the blessings of God. It's also to be a time of renewal, physical, spiritual, emotional, relational renewal. It's to be a time of rejuvenation, revitalization. It doesn't mean you can't do anything, but what you do needs to be revitalizing. If taking a walk in the afternoon, if whatever kind of hobby you might have, of having a barbecue, of spending time with friends, is part of your reverence and renewal of the day. That's wonderful. We're to rejuvenate. And ultimately, a restoration for the weeks to come ahead. You, as my father used to say, if you burn both ends of the candle, you will burn out. And that is so true. Rest, reflection, reverence, renewal, rejuvenation, restoration. Those are all principles and aspects of the Sabbath, whatever Sabbath you have. And if your Sunday is part of your Sabbath, then make sure that you don't exhaust yourself with church or exhaust yourself with church activities. It's not about church. It's about Shabbat, the Sabbath. And yes, gathering together for worship, gathering together for prayer, gathering together for a meal, gathering together to fellowship, but not to a place of exhaustion. Now, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 27 through 31. Isaiah is rebuking the people. Why do you say, O Jacob, and assert, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escapes the notice of my God? They thought that they were getting away with their sins and their Sabbath violations. He says, do you not know, have you not heard, the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. He gives strength to the weary, and to him who lacks might, he increases power. Though youth may grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly from exhaustion or other things or judgment, yet those who wait on the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. We must pace ourselves and avoid the left lane of the highway and racing about and speeding about and trying to accomplish so much in life that we burn out and ruin the weeks and the months and the years, and particularly the latter years. You really need to read Ecclesiastes 11 and 12. Read the whole book, but In 11, it says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. It says, follow the passions of your heart. But then it says, do all of this, remembering that you're going to stand before God and give an account, and that you need to enjoy your youth before the days of aging and pain come upon you. Now, Matthew 11, 28 and 30, Jesus said to the people, and he was talking to them physically, socially, and spiritually, I believe. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The people were burning themselves out with the labor for false gods and false wealth and false hopes, and you will find rest for your souls. Comes out of the Old Testament, when the children of Israel are rebuked for not keeping the Sabbath principle. So we need to follow this. There are so many other passages that speak of be still and know that I am God, and rest and relax and sit back and enjoy God, and eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow has enough of its troubles and difficulties. So there's some scriptures to guide and direct you in regards to the principle of the Sabbath, and that we need to stop the life of anxiety, the life of pursuing temporal things, and to take time to reflect, to rest, to renewal, to reverence God, to rejuvenate, to restore, and to enjoy. God wants us to enjoy him first of all, foremost of all, loving the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our strength, all our might, and then to enjoy and love our neighbor. So take a Sabbath, take a vacation, take a break, and enjoy life.